The depression of the 1930s began in Wall Street with a share price crash. But how did it get from Wall Street to the rest of the world? That is the story of a cross-border banking crisis, social unrest, countries reneging on their debts, and the breakdown of an international currency system. And if that sounds familiar, it should. What is haunting the world's leaders as they prepare for the G20 summit is a repeat of the early 30s.
In the 1930s, there was a great fracturing of globalization. So countries which had been used to cooperating with each other in a number of ways then all took to doing their own thing. They took to doing their own thing politically, and they took to doing their own thing economically.
The world that collapsed in 1931 was a glittering, ultra-modern world. The economic recovery of the 20s had produced Art Deco, luxury for the masses. And for the elite, as with the Courtauld family in its purpose-built Deco mansion, what could possibly go wrong? The 1920s had seen rapid technological advance, so when the crisis started it looked like just a blip. What had produced all this was a global system of trade and currencies based on gold. But in the fight to save that system, they would destroy almost everything else.
One of the things that happened in the 1930s was that the very mechanism which people focused on, which they thought would promote globalization, actually was a contributor to its end.
The gold standard was a system of fixed exchange rates that obliged governments to balance their books long term. But in the worst hit countries, once the downturn started, sticking to gold forced governments to make austerity worse. Today, some worry what happened with the gold standard could happen with the euro. Here again, adherence to the rules is forcing some countries to impose harsh austerity. And even as the streets erupt, the European political class has convinced itself that nobody can leave the euro.
The critical thing about Europe is the single currency and the way that all these 17 countries are tied together by one exchange rate. The parallel with the early 30s is clearly the gold standard, where some countries believe that the gold standard was the basis for prosperity, and the reality was that it was imposing enormous deflation on some countries, and the UK was one of the first to break away.
Britain's exit from gold in 1931 forms a case study in how events can confound a currency peg. First, the Labour government collapsed over the levels of austerity required to stay on gold. Then, amid defence cuts, the Royal Navy mutinied.
Those particular spending cuts led to parts of the Royal Navy fearing that they were going to have very large salary cuts, and there was a mutiny which included, in fact, the flagship of the Navy, the Hood, at a place called Invergordon. This, in mid-September 1931, triggered a very widespread panic. People thought there might be a coup or all kinds of things, and international investors really panicked in respect of the UK, and the government quite soon after gave up on the attempt to hold the gold standard.
When Britain came off gold, the establishment was so shocked that one former Labour minister said, "We didn't know you could do that." Germany and Japan came off gold in the same year, and the industrial output figures show those who ran for the exits first recovered first. The depression of the 1930s was felt worst by those countries that were last to abandon their commitment to the global system: America and France. Of course, we know what happened. Within a decade, the big powers were engaged in trade wars, currency wars, land grabs, and ultimately military conflict. And the problem today is you can just see the beginnings of some of that. When the USA decided on a second round of quantitative easing, so-called QE2, the result was to boost inflation in the rapidly developing countries like Brazil. Brazil's finance minister called it economic war and retaliated, imposing controls on the flow of foreign capital. Japan, fearing its exports would be hit by a cheaper dollar, intervened to weaken its own currency. Then Switzerland, still a major player in manufacturing, did the same. And then Japan did it again this week, and so did Argentina. That's led some to fear the breakup of globalisation, others to welcome it.
I don't think there is a danger with retreating from globalisation, because globalisation, as the way it's constructed, has caused a lot of the problems that led to the credit crunch. So we've got to ask ourselves critically, is this what we really want going forward? A world that is dominated by very large companies with very weak labour power. And, you know, in a sense, it's not an even playing field at the moment, because you've got Asian governments that are effectively gaming the system by manipulating its change rate.
And last week's Euro deal injected, potentially, more friction into that argument. Europe needs to borrow $1 trillion, but when the man doing the borrowing turned up in China with his begging bowl, he was told, stop criticising us over currency, and then we'll see. In the early 30s, even as the global economy slid towards breakup, the band played on. This was a world in which radio was growing rapidly, the movies were beginning to talk, public morals were getting looser. Today, it seems impossible that our global system could disappear. So much of our culture is bound up with it. But theirs did. In some countries, within a decade, the whole world of jazz, loose morals, and modern art was gone.
There is no legal justification whatever for France not paying the current installment of $20 million on her debt to us.
Two things drove the breakup: debts that had become politicised and social unrest.
When the police proved unable to handle the rioters, the regular army routed them in a street battle.
On the streets, once unrest broke out, it proved impossible for politicians to resist a national route out of the crisis. This time around, free market economists have been at the forefront of defending globalisation, but now some are beginning to see the possibility of retreat. Do you think it's realistic for us to still be talking about a global, multilateral solution to this crisis?
I think it's both unrealistic, and if it were realistic, it would be a mistake. I believe it would be better at this stage for us each to look to our own ramparts, each try our own thing, and then if we see that something's working better somewhere else than what we've tried, we can copy them. If you wait too long and then end up doing your own thing anyway, then you will find that you do your own thing in an environment in which the populations and the politicians who then turn up as their spokesman blame international coordination for the events. They will say, we've been forced by the Germans or the Americans or the IMF or the UN to do things this way, and part of our identity now is that we're against them, the enemy.
In Greece, that's already happening. But the Occupy protests too, though international, are each putting pressure on national governments to act. Here again, say the economists, there are lessons from history.
You should not underestimate the social and economic peril of neglecting the moral aspect of policy. If people are subject to injustice for long enough, they will ultimately reject that, and the political consequences can be terrifying.
1934, the San Francisco General Strike.
Here is industrial strife, which is war worse than the World War. The war of neighbour against neighbour.
Today, we're a lot richer than people were in the 30s, and that should cushion the blow. But our social cohesion is lower. To a generation whose future has been cancelled, it may be of little comfort that things were worse back then.